So Dr. Jasser, Amy Holmes here, and I share with you sort of this misdefinition of the word surveillance. I think the NYPD is also reaching out to the Muslim community, which by and large, most members of the community despise these types of acts by these malcontents and jihadists. But I have a more awkward and uncomfortable question, which is I watched that radicalization, or I just watched it a box of that chart, and I know lots of religious people who have gone through the first three steps, people of other faiths, because they simply become more devout. They do separate themselves from the community because they want to devote themselves to a life of faith. But only in Islam does it seem that you get to that last step of jihad. Why is that?
Well, because the first two steps, and that's why this process is so important, the first two steps include a membership in a global political movement that is hatched from the Muslim Brotherhood, that includes the Jamaat Islami of Pakistan, includes the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia, the Salafis. It's sort of this political movement that seeks domination. So it's not just a personal spiritual movement. And that's what's happened in the West, where you have a separation of church and state. The personal spiritual does not interfere in movements that want to take over governments. But when you talk about Islamism, and let's look at Boston, for example. Boston itself has had two major convictions of Al-Qaeda operatives in 2010, where the Afia Siddiqui was convicted to 28 years, and Tariq Mahena convicted almost a year to the day of the bombing in federal court in Boston. And he gave this long speech about how he was targeted, but yet America was targeting innocents and raping and killing women in Iraq. He gave this speech in courtroom, and if you look at the Muslim community in Boston, most of the imams and leaders gave speeches about how he was incorrectly convicted, and there was no balance. So the narrative, and this radicalization is all about the narrative. The first two steps are a narrative that Americans are anti-Muslim, anti-Islam. It pushes them away. So political Islam is the early steps of radicalization. And then you put on top of that the spiritual jihad, where they feel that they're going to leave this world in a burst of glory, killing the inhuman Americans. That is the last few steps. And until
Dr. Jasser,
I
want to ask, Will, you know, we're addressing a bunch of issues here. Do you have concerns on the civil liberties side? I mean, I know actually both of you tend to be very consistent on the libertarian side of these issues. Is surveilling a community in public something that makes you uncomfortable?
I don't, but I would. I would if we went into these areas that would start to intrude upon the concept of civil liberties. You said we're touching on a lot of issues. I think it's very, very important we clarify which issues are getting conflated here. I think one, and actually they're not getting conflated at this table. They're being separated well, but they could even be further redefined, and that is the debate over civil liberties. That debate of treating one area of the population different with their constitutional rights than any other. And I don't think anyone, including Congressman Peter King, has proposed that. And there's also the idea of effective law enforcement. Now, Ellison is rebutting the concept that this would be an effective law enforcement to concentrate on the Islamic population. And Dr. Jasser made an important point. Not all Muslims are Islamists, but all Islamists are Muslim. So it would it not, Anthony, effective law enforcement to focus on that population?
Only in the same sense that you put more cops in neighborhoods that have higher crime and they just happen to be low-income communities. And so, you know, it's not to say that everybody that's poor is going to commit a crime, but that's where you put more cops, but only in that limited sense. And the problem is that we have this conversation in context of wiretaps. So usually when I'm listening to Peter King, I do think that he is talking about something more than just standing on the street. What's important to note is that the goal of this monitoring is to keep people safe. There's very low chance of being killed by a terrorist, whether or not it's a Muslim terrorist and whatnot. And given that the high costs and the ineffectiveness of that use of resources compared to the actual low level of danger, this is not other than the very loose level of policing, this is not an effective use of police forces.
Well, and police force, FBI monitoring aside, I think we've agreed also that this is in some ways going to be a moderate Muslim community problem, and for moderate Muslims to solve. I don't know much about the mosque that Tamerlan was said to have attended regularly, other than what I've heard in news reports.
And that he was kicked out.
That he was kicked out. Well, who else was watching this happen? Who else knew what he was talking about and the kinds of things he was saying? And what other moderate Muslims in his life were able to maybe see some of these red flags? There's only so much that we on the outside can do. It has to be a problem that moderate Islam wants to deal with.
The best guardians of this come from within the community. It's true.